Welcome back to another edition of Dr. Bickmore's YA Wednesday. And Margarita Engle, welcome. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me
here. Yeah. Margarita, can you tell us a little bit about how you got to this point as a writer? How did you get here?
Well, I was a reader, and I think that writing is a natural next step from being a reader. So as a young child, my mother would read to me a lot, and we would go to the library, and she read me poetry in Spanish, Jose Marti, and then stories in English, picture books from the library. So by the time I was about 6, as I would walk to school, I sort of made up poems in my mind to the rhythm of my footsteps. And I think of poetry as music, as a musical language. I have a terrible singing voice, but in poetry, I feel like there is a bit of like I feel like I'm singing inside, you know, even silently. So I didn't make up poems out loud, but they had a rhythm of walking, and they were about nature. They were about whatever I was passing by. So by the time I was around 15, I had kept reading a lot of poetry throughout my teenage years. And by the time I was about 15, I turned to my mother one day and said, I can't find any books about Cuba, so someday I'll write one. And she is the type of mother who says, oh, you can do anything you want. Little streak of feminism there in her very old-fashioned traditional Cuban upbringing. And so eventually I did, but it was not a direct path. I got discouraged along the way in high school when I was put into a honors creative writing class where I didn't understand the process of critiquing. And whenever anybody said something they didn't like a poem, I would just, oh, I should never write again. They don't like it. I'm no good. I won't write. And I didn't keep writing creative writing except for secretly, kept my poems secret. I didn't share them again for many years. I had fallen in love with tropical nature as a child during visits to Cuba to relatives. And I studied botany and agronomy and became an agronomy professor, actually the first woman agronomy professor at the technical university where I taught in California. So I did a lot of technical writing at that point, and scientific writing, which is very different. You cannot put any creativity. There's no music. It has to be just the basics. You say what you mean. You know, take the adjectives out, and certainly no metaphors or similes. So I eventually was called back to poetry when I took a creative writing seminar from Tomas Rivera, who was at the time the first Latino chancellor of University of California at UC Riverside, wow, where I was supposed to be finishing my PhD in botany. And I just never looked back. I changed back to creative writing, gave up tenure, gave up all career income and job security and all that stuff, and just went into the process of receiving hundreds of rejections in a row before I get a little acceptance. So I wrote a lot of poetry for small journals and opinion columns for Hispanic Link News Service. And then eventually, when I started returning to Cuba in 1991, I hadn't been there since 1960. There was unfinished business in getting to know my relatives again and falling in love with certain things again, and on the other hand, being horrified by others. And so I started writing fiction and poetry about Cuba again at that point. So midlife. I came to children's books very late in life.
What a gift to work with Tomas Rivera.
Yes, the one thing he really taught me was to write from the heart without worrying about what's popular and without ever worrying about whether it will be published.
Wow.
To write for oneself.
So,
And I'm pretty good at assuming that nothing will ever be published at the moment when I start my first draft, which first draft is my great love. I feel the freest when
yeah.
I'm in that first draft that nobody else will ever see, because I'm gonna have to revise it a bunch of times before it's ever submitted to my agent and editor. And I feel very free at that point. There is a different kind of confidence that comes from writing for yourself rather than for publication. Writing because you really have something to say. And then later you do all the revisions that might make it publishable.
Yeah, that's so insightful. And when you were, I know that you're, I mean, I've read Enchanted Air and Your Heart, My Sky, and then I'm familiar with the other books. So go ahead and show them to the camera. So we haven't, I'm not going to share them in order. Sorry, I'm just grabbing whatever's here. But we have Enchanted Air, which is a memoir in verse, and won numerous recognitions. The Walter Award, it's always hard. The Pura Bellare Award.
Pura
Belpre Award. And then it was a YALSA finalist for the excellence in young adult nonfiction. And then Your Heart, My Sky, which came out in 2021, so very recent book. Rima's Rebellion. And
that
then
comes out next month. Rima's Rebellion will come out next month in February. Yes, that's the advance review copy there.
And then With a Star in My Hand. So when you were constructing and writing, when did you get to a point when you were constructing collections that told a story as a whole?
Well, I wrote some adult novels first in the 90s. And eventually I switched to, after discovering young adult verse novels and middle grade verse novels in the children's literature world, this seemed so much more suited to what I love to do than the traditional prose novel that's required for most adult fiction. It's just not as flexible. So once I discovered this verse novel form, I fell in love and I kept doing it. And that is what I really love to do. Now, when I did the memoir, Enchanted Air, this was going to be different because it is a memoir. And I really debated with myself, do I write this in past tense because it happened a long time ago in my childhood? Because then I would lose the immediacy that I get in poetry, where I usually write in present tense and in first person. And I decided to keep present tense. Even though the events happen in the past, I wanted to invite the reader to time travel with me and be there as if it were happening now.
Well, you certainly achieved that goal. It's a magical book.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about the process then that you go about when writing a book?
I love peace and quiet. For writing poetry, the thing about a book is that it is one poem at a time for a verse novel. Even though I might have an outline, the outline changes as I go along. And I'm really facing one page at a time. And to face one page at a time, what I need is peace and quiet and some time.
Mhm.
And I explore, I experiment. I try it this way, I try it that way. I'll come back to it later after I've written subsequent poems. And after that outline has changed, and I may change it the first poem completely. But I do my first draft with pen and paper and peace and quiet. And it's really a process of exploration. I believe that, for instance, for teaching kids to write, the most important thing for them is to feel a sense of freedom. And I think there is freedom in using a pen and paper. Whenever you go on the computer, there's billions of people out there judging you. There's the temptation to go on social media. There's all these other things happening in the digital world. Whereas when you're alone with your pen and paper, there's a different kind of flow. The ink flows, but time also flows. Time is different with pen and paper. You do have to go to the computer to do all the corrections and revisions and later drafts, of course, and that's hard work. But the first draft should be sheer pleasure rather than hard work. It should be a process of exploring. And no matter how emotional the subject matter is, as Enchanted Air, of course, was very emotional for me, and so are these other books. But the musical language of poetry gives me a kind of pleasure, as with other forms of music, where I can just enjoy it.
You talking about sitting down with pen and paper makes me remember that in order to finish my dissertation, I dismantled my office computer. I literally took it apart. And I didn't use pen and paper to write my dissertation, but I did use an old laptop that had no wireless capability. So that I could just simply use it to word process, because I think you're right. I think that when you can fully invest in that moment and be present to that moment, those other distractions can fall away and really allow you to tune into yourself in ways that the other things just distract us from.
You don't want any notifications or little beeps, or
Yeah. So can you say anything else about your writing routine? You mentioned, sitting down with pen and paper, sitting down in the quiet, but are there other elements of your writing routine you'd like to tell us about?
I'm a morning person. I write very early in the morning, and it lasts for as long as my caffeine lasts. I don't understand writers. I know there are lots of them, but I don't understand writers who stay up late at night to write. That's just not me. I get up early in the morning to write. I also don't understand writers who go to crowded, noisy coffee shops. Again, I need peace and quiet. And if there's good weather, even some of my books have been written almost entirely outdoors for the first drafts.
I think of Ernest Hemingway. I visited his house in Key West a couple of years ago, and had the joy of going up to the bedroom and seeing a little catwalk he walked across to get to his office. And he wrote 75% of his work, I think, between the hours of like 9 o'clock and 2, or 9 and 1, and then he would spend the rest of his day fishing. So he must have just decided that he was going to really, power through for those 4 hours every day.
Well, I don't know much about his life in Key West, but I know that in Cuba, he may have been more sober in the morning too.
Yeah, it was an interesting visit, visiting the house. But I do talk to writers who they have a routine, but they also, like you said, you write as long as the caffeine holds out, as long as the caffeine lasts, and we have to know our limits, right? So that, have there been times when you've thought, okay, I'm done with this piece, I'm just going to give myself a break? How do you know when that is? Um, when do you kind of set that limit for yourself?
If I were to say that I have a goal, and I'm not strict about goals, but if I've written one page in a day, I can
Mhm.
feel quite satisfied. Now, it may not be a publishable page. I may have to come back to it many times, but a page is a big accomplishment.
It is.
And so, again, if you're teaching young people about writing, they may challenge themselves like, oh, all I did is one page. Instead, we can tell them that is a lot. That's wonderful. Um, the only way to write a book is one page at a time. To say that you're going to sit down and write a book today is like saying, okay, I'm going to lose 50 pounds today.
Mhm.
That's not how it's done. It's done one page at a time.
Yeah. One bite at a time. Yeah. So what role does community play in your writing? Do you share your writing with other people? Are you part of a group?
I was when I was getting started. I did belong to a writers group, but I found it, it was wonderful in some ways, but it was also frustrating in some ways because the people who ended up being my friends um, wanted, certain changes. And so I would write to please them. And then I would find that my agent and later my editor wanted different changes. And sometimes they were telling me to go back to the way it had been in the first place. And I was like, oh, why did I listen to anybody else? So I prefer now to take advice from my agent and editor rather than from a
Mhm.
wide variety of people who may all tell me different things. Um, I do love to have a writing community. I feel like um, poets and also verse novelists are a very small kind of fringe group in the world of publishing. And so people who do the kind of books that I do, we have a certain kinship. The one time I tried to collaborate was with Padma Venkatraman, and we did a
Yes.
picture book of poems together. I love her poetry. It didn't get published, but we certainly developed a closeness. And there are people who I've only met in person a few times that I feel close to based on reading their books and talking to them about their books.
Padma's a treasure, isn't she?
Yes, I
So
love her books.
it sounds like um you rely on your writing community for encouragement, for camaraderie, but that you defer to, your editor and your agent for more expert advice regarding the direction of your writing. And in that way, it's like you're able to stay true to that original goal that you had of being true to yourself as a
Yes,
writer, right? By
it,
making those choices.
yes, it's much more focused for me in that way. And of course, not every project that I try ends up being published.
Mhm.
Most of the verse novels eventually do get published. They may change a lot along the way, but I'd say that probably 50% of my picture books never do get published.
Mm. Mhm.
And so all of this is just part of the rejections, the changes, all of those things, the delays. There've been a lot of delays with the pandemic where publishing deadlines, some editors have been furloughed. A lot of people have moved. Not everybody lives in New York anymore. All sorts of things have caused delays where patience and perseverance are two of the skills that a writer needs to develop. They don't come naturally.
Well, and learning to depend on oneself, which, especially during these uncertain times, if you were relying on a lot of other people to help you get your writing along, maybe you would be disappointed. Maybe you wouldn't be as productive. But by establishing that you're writing for yourself early on, I mean, if you keep writing, you're not necessarily disappointing yourself, right? You're being true to yourself consistently.
True, that's true. And I think that one of the riskiest things to do is to try to get feedback from relatives.
Oh,
And so with the memoir, because I was writing about my family, I did show it to my mother before it was published and said, "Is this okay with you?" And she read parts of it to my father, and he asked for one small change. My mother was thrilled. She asked for no changes. But later, after it was published, my sister read it and she said, "Someday I'll tell you how I remember that particular event." She said she just had completely different memories of certain things, perspectives. So yeah, it's a lot of pressure to, for instance, ask one's spouse to give you feedback. That puts them in an awkward position. And if one does want an early reader, I think it's better to ask another writer instead of a spouse who's not a writer.
Absolutely. That's great advice. Can you talk a little bit about some recurring themes that you see as you write? As you're writing, and then you're reading what you've written, and as you've established this, renowned body of work, what do you notice about what you're writing? And I just want to call attention to Your Heart, My Sky, because I was keeping track of some themes, but I think this idea of hunger is such an interesting idea in that book, and the ways that hunger is intersected with this power of love and of connection. And I'm wondering about other themes that come up in writing.
Tragically, hunger, it was the experience of Cuba in the 90s, and it is again now, because Cuba's economy has been revised in recent years to depend entirely on tourism, which was cut off by COVID. So once again, the ration lines for food are hours long. People spend all day just trying to get something to eat. So it's very tragic. Hunger is not something that I would choose for a theme if it weren't part of that history. But I have very strong environmental themes in many of my books because of being a botanist and agronomist. And again, agronomy is related, of course, to food production. But in addition to the environmental themes, peace is very personal for me. And peace plays an important role in all of my stories. I have a terrible before and after in my childhood that I wrote about in Enchanted Ear, and that was the loss of travel rights at the time of the missile crisis. So when I was a child, traveling back and forth to spend the summers with, my abuelita and bisabuelita, tios, primos, all the extended family seemed so natural. But by the time I was a teenager, it was easier for a US citizen to walk on the moon than to visit a grandmother in Cuba. So for me, every time I say that, every time I talk about losing travel rights, it's very emotional and very personal. And so the theme of peace comes up over and over because these things that countries do, that both countries did, of travel restrictions, those types of things affect families, they affect individuals, they affect children and teenagers. And so I think that by listening to each other's stories, we can develop empathy and compassion, and those are the seeds of peace. And I love writing for young people because they're the only possible peacemakers of the future. I also write the environmental stories for them because they're the only possible environmentalists of the future. And peace gives hope, and nature gives hope. And so in times when there are conflicts between groups of humans, and also conflicts between humans and nature, I think that we need to look towards young people, and we need to listen to them too.
Would you be
When I ask children how long they stay mad at each other, if they were to get mad at someone, how long do you stay angry? They say 2 hours. They don't say 60 years. So
Yeah, that sounds about right.
For two countries to scorn each other for 60 years has been very painful. It's more than 6 years now.
Especially when one country is starving.
Well, yes, and yet both countries are to blame for that, for the hunger. Cuba certainly did things that contributes to its own hunger too.
Can you say a little bit about this idea of peace and of your hope in young people in the context of Rima's Rebellion, your new book that's coming out?
Yes, Rima's Rebellion is about a suffragist in Cuba in the 1920s and 30s, and there certainly is a violent rebellion included in the story, which was to overthrow the dictator Machado. Rima herself becomes a typesetter, so she's not the violent herself, but the women who were struggling for suffrage to get the vote. This is the great irony of any suffrage movement, had to convince men to vote for women's suffrage. It's the same thing, of course, in the United States, but it happened a little bit earlier in the United States and in England. In Cuba, this movement didn't become complete until the 30s. And for me, my mother was born in 1930, before women had the right to vote. My grandmother was born long before women had the right to vote. So some of these things become, again, very personal to me when I realize how recently, and in the United States too, how recently women gained the right to vote. It's shocking. And if you look at the timeline at the end of the book, many countries are much more recent than that. And so I really feel like this is an ongoing struggle to keep women's rights. There are people who would chip away at them Would they eventually try to take our right to vote? I don't know, but there's certainly there is certainly the need for equality on every level. And I wanted to write about the combination of the things women were struggling for at that time in Cuba. They were struggling for suffrage, and they were struggling for the right for poor children to be educated along with rich children, but specifically illegitimate children, children whose father did not give them their surname, did not have the same right to education as others. There was no child support. It was a strange time, and they also were struggling against a law that allowed men to legally murder wives or daughters who were caught with lovers. So this book is obviously for teenagers, for quite mature. It's not for young children. But that was that femicide is an important aspect of Latin American history that many people are not familiar with, and it's very recent.
Yeah, it reminds me of of the phrase, you know, we talk about no as in N-O, no justice, no peace, right? And then no as in no justice and no peace. You know, if you know in your mind and with your body what is just, and you're allowed to experience that justice, then peace will come, right? But you know, without that justice, you know, there's going to be unrest, you know. And so thank you for that. And this comes out in February, correct?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. That's great. I will make sure that I do a weekend pick with this the next opportunity I have, so that we can.
Thank you.
Yeah. So when you hear from young readers, what are some of the things that you hear from them when they write to you, when they meet you at signings or at conferences?
Yeah, I write such a variety of kinds of books, from picture books to, you know, to these quite mature young adult books, and some that are in between, some middle grade. And a lot of my books are actually very suited to the kind of mature sixth graders on up, even maybe mature fifth graders on up. So they're not all strictly teenagers. So there's really a variety of questions that would come from different age groups. Younger children always want to know the name of my dog. That is the one most common question in elementary school visits. Do you have a dog? My dog's name is, what is your dog's name? So,
okay, well, you better tell us. You better tell us. Do you have a dog, and what is your dog's name?
Well, I've written some dog books, and so I think that's where those questions come from. And my husband and I worked with wilderness search and rescue dogs a lot over the years. We have a retired search and rescue dog, Labrador Retriever named Chance, and a young border collie named Dabby. And she doesn't have a job right now, but she needs one. But for older kids, one of the things that, rather than the most common question, I'll tell you the most important one is older kids, older elementary and teenagers, often, if I'm doing a talk where I read a poem to them, they will often read a poem of their own back to me. And some have even memorized their own poem. And that is the most important part of that experience, I think, that interchange. Some authors have said, oh, I don't want to read to them, they'll be bored. But no, when we read to them, they often want to share what they've written too. And I actually had one class that I spoke to where the teacher thought of all the students as reluctant readers. They had been sent to her as reluctant readers. And she was shocked when one of these high school boys pulled a poem out of his pocket and read it to the whole group. They're not just reading to me, they're reading to their classmates, which takes tremendous courage. And she said, I didn't know he could read. I certainly didn't know he could write. So this points out that poetry is a refuge. It's a refuge. It's a safe place for all of those emotions. And it's an interactive experience. Any poem in my book could be followed by somebody else's poem, their response to it from their own experience.
Poetry is a conversation.
It is, and the open spaces on the page, those open spaces are not blank. They contain a sort of echo, like a reverberation, like you get after you ring a bell. And that's the kind of space that's interactive, where the readers and the writers' emotions meet in midair and communicate and understand each other.
Yeah.
I think that for teachers, the one thing that I would say that's most important in teaching poetry is to never judge the student's interpretation of a poem too harshly. You don't want to make them feel like they've failed to understand the poem, because we all interpret the same poem differently. And we interpret the same poem differently on different days, depending on our own emotions that day, because poetry is so emotional. So rather than say to students, what does this poem mean? I would ask to consider saying, how does this poem make you feel instead?
Yes. Amen.
It's
there
very
are a
different.
million teachers watching this interview and cheering at their computers right now, hearing you say that.
Oh, good. I would love to give everybody permission to never ask, what does the poem mean?
Yes. It's interesting because as teachers, we also get in the habit of knowing what we teach really, really well. And so the challenge for me as a teacher, and has always been for me, I mean, I started teaching in '99, from high school to college. If I know a piece really well, certainly I can do service to the piece, but I do better service to the piece if I read it alongside my students and we responded to that piece together. And it was a cold read with them, just like they're reading, and I have found that exercise to be tremendously generative, because instead of it being, guess what the teacher's thinking, it truly becomes an exercise in how are we experiencing this piece together. And once I've done that, it's hard for me to go back
Well,
to the other way.
And if teachers need evidence of this being true, that how does the poem make you feel is more important than what does the poem mean, evidence of it is that many poets, including me, have not been able to answer the questions about our own poems that we see on standardized tests.
Right. I can tell you how I felt when I wrote it, right?
Right.
But,
but reading it a week later or a year later, I may bring different emotions to the same poem.
Absolutely. It's the ancient philosopher. I'm trying to remember his name, but he said, you never dip your foot into the same river twice. No, it's a different river the next time you dip your foot into it. The water's different, your surroundings are different, all of those things, never the same. So,
well, and because poetry is music, it is musical language. Do we listen to music to interpret it, or do we listen to music to enjoy it?
yeah. Right. Well, there's the beauty, right? And I think so much of that can be lost with English teaching. And let's hope that your work will help to bring kind of a return to that emphasis on the aesthetic versus the analytic. So I'm curious, you shared advice that you have for teachers. Do you have any advice for young writers besides the idea of, being true to themselves as writers?
Yes, well, reading a lot. Read. If when people say they want to write, but they don't have time to read, that's not going to work.
Exactly.
That's just not, you're not on the path towards writing if you aren't just reading constantly and widely and loving to read. Loving to write is born from loving to read. But I would also say that writing is an art, and there's no art that anyone ever performs in public without rehearsing first. So practice. You need to practice. Don't expect your first draft or your first manuscript to be publishable. Don't judge yourself too harshly. Imagine going out, and not just an art, any skill. Imagine going out to perform a ballet without having rehearsed. Imagine going out to play soccer competitively without having practiced. You need to just write a little bit every day, and choose a time of day, and that's your time of day to write. And over the years, you improve.
That's great advice. So what questions do you wish people would ask you about your writing?
Well, I love it when people ask if a book is available in Spanish, because a few years ago, I always had to say, no, I'm sorry. But now, over the last few years, I've been so happy that my editors do make sure that there are Spanish editions of all my new books. So I work with a wonderful translator, Alexis Romay. He's a Cuban poet. My editor at Athenaeum, who's the editor of most of these books, Reka Simonson, always makes sure that there's a Spanish edition, usually simultaneous, sometimes a year later. Like for Your Heart, My Sky, it wasn't ready to come out at the same time, but it will soon. So Enchanted Ear is Aire Encantado, and there's a sequel, a high school college sequel, Soaring Earth, which is also available in Spanish. All the picture books are coming out in Spanish. It's really wonderful. So
that's exciting.
I like to have a question asked where I can give a positive answer. It's good news that publishers are doing more translations.
Can you say a little bit about the audiobooks related to the books that you've written?
Yeah, the audiobooks, for the picture books, they do audio video. So it's kind of like they take the actual illustrations and animate them. Those are wonderful. For the books for older readers, there are audiobooks. Now, I personally don't listen to a lot of audiobooks, but I'm happy that they're available for those who do want to. I also don't read electronic
Mhm,
books.
mhm.
I love paper.
Yes. Well, many of our young readers do too. They thought that the introduction of the Kindle was going to, X out books altogether, but books are back. I mean, they've never gone away, you know?
And yet I'm so happy that the electronic versions are
Yes,
available for people who need a bigger font and can control
absolutely.
the font, for for people who do enjoy reading that way. I just think that when it comes to books, the more the better, the wider
Yes,
variety, the better. I think that we need all sorts of books, and that when a student walks into a library, there should just be,
mhm,
it's like a candy store. Where do I start? What do I choose? There should be just lots of choices.
yes.
And they, at the, free reading time is one of the wonderful memories of my childhood and teen years, to be able to choose anything you want.
I agree. And I think I am a champion for pleasure reading at any level. And especially with my college students who, like, for many of them, the last book that they read for pleasure was like in the sixth grade, and so they, in my classes, have opportunities to read for pleasure, and I'll do book talks at the beginning of each class to talk about what I'm reading. And um, that is an important skill. We know that that's an important skill, to be able to read for fun. In
It,
fact, we know it's like correlated positively with, educational, social, and economic mobility. The ability to read for pleasure. It's a social justice value. So I remember, like, walking into New York City's reading room, on the top floor of their library, and feeling just overcome by emotion, that this is a space, it's this gorgeous space, with these beautiful feelings, and, you know, natural light, and these people that are just there to read, and I think the more we can represent that joy to our students, the better. So would you be willing to tell us, this is my last question for you, what are you working on now?
I'm actually working on a companion book for Your Heart, My Sky. It will come out in 2023, and it's about the Cubans who have left in recent years. They can't get visas to enter the United States directly. They can't get visas to enter most countries directly. They fly to South America and walk. So they're mixed in those caravans of Haitians and Central Americans who are walking all the way from South America. And a few years ago, 2018, about 20,000 Cubans got delayed in Costa Rica while walking from South America. Nicaragua closed its border to Cubans, so they were, I don't want to say stuck, because I love Costa Rica and I don't think of it as a place where you get stuck,
Mhm,
but they were delayed there in refugee camps. And I wrote a young adult love story set in that
mhm.
time period, but it's also very much a wildlife rescue and climate action environmental story.
Mm. Can't wait. It sounds
Thank you.
really good.
Thank you.
And you do such an amazing job of shedding light on stories that many of our young people, just being kind of out of that. Now, 2018 is relatively recent, but Your Heart, My Sky, was 1991.
Yes,
So there,
I
it's bringing these stories to young people so that they can remember.
and I think of it as a companion piece to Your Heart, My Sky, because it kind of shows where the people who were young at that time, where the next generation ended up, which is with protests against the censorship of the arts in Cuba, which has been extreme in
Mhm,
recent years.
mhm,
And many people who are leaving because poets and writers, artists, musicians are all so extremely persecuted there at this time.
Yeah. Oh, this has been such a gift talking to you, Margarita. I'm excited to send this interview out to the world. And
Thank
I
you.
thank you for your work on behalf of young readers. I thank you for being true to your own writing self so that you can produce these amazing works of literature that we can share with our students and validate their own experiences in their classrooms, especially the students who feel like they're, you know, straddling two worlds. Thank you for continuing to write. We're excited to see what you come up with.
Thank you
So
so much. I really
yes,
appreciate it.
yes. Thank you.